Hi folks, this is David Brown with Brown Group Solutions. Welcome to the Project Management Notes from the Field. Today I'll be talking with Rashid Kapadia about his new book entitled Necessary Bridges, which was written specifically for project managers and engineers, but would be useful to anyone interested in public speaking and storytelling. Please note that I have also included a full-length presentation by Rashid conducted earlier this year at the HESS Club in Houston, Texas. I'll include this link in the show notes below. Hi Rashid, would you like to kick off this discussion by describing a little bit about your background and why you decided to write this book about public speaking?
Thank you, David. It's a pleasure to be on. David, my background is I was born and raised in India. And I was fortunate. I was always surrounded by books. I went to good schools, good colleges. And I remember a phase towards the end of my training when I was particularly fascinated by good writing, especially in magazines. I remember being more interested in the way the article was written rather than the politics. I've been a lifelong reader. And in India, when I grew up, David, there were not too many options in careers. We could either be engineers or doctors, so I became an engineer. That's how I went into the world of marine engineering. However, when I was young, my father was a very, very committed Rotarian, and he used to do a lot of good work. Sometimes we used to go to his meetings with him, and he was a mesmerizing speaker. So I believe I came to admire and appreciate public speaking from a very young age because of that. Also, through school and college, public speaking was something I did on and off. So that's my background for public speaking. I was involved in that world. Marine engineering is a very, very fascinating field, like all engineering. But primarily, David, I remember being fascinated by what human beings are capable of doing. And when you're on ships, it's 4 or 5 engineers and you have to keep everything going. So you have to be resourceful. And I did learn that there is always a way. I had a fairly successful career after coming to the top rank in the marine engineering world, which is a chief engineer. I decided to do something different. I applied to a few colleges in the United States and came here as a student for marine management. I've had a good career here, worked for a couple of companies, a startup, which didn't last for very long, a very stable ship repair offshore modification company. I had a good innings there. I worked for an engine manufacturing company based in Finland, headquartered in Finland, but I did a lot of project management with this company. So I thoroughly enjoyed the work. I enjoyed the challenges. I enjoyed working with people, especially with diverse people. That's a little bit about my background. Now, how did I come to write a book? My wife says she's not one bit surprised I wrote one because I always, through reading and writing, believed I loved it. But it's probably more specific. You have to have something that's driving you. And in one of my development sessions, it's called a 360 survey, at the end of the conversation, which was excellent, the lady asked me, "Are you sure you're an engineer?" And I was really puzzled by this. And she said she hadn't spoken to an engineer like me. And on thinking, I came to realize that what separates me from probably the people she trained was that I had acquired some expertise in public speaking and storytelling, and it could tell even in these offbeat conversations. So I saw there was a need out here. However, I was quite happy with my career, but as times change and industries change and there were reorganizations, my son had finished with college and I decided that if I'm going to go independent now would be a good time. So I took a break and I decided to write the book, very specifically targeted towards engineers and project managers, but to anyone who wants to improve in public speaking. I was surprised. I planned to write about 150 to 175 page book, but it became a research project and I kept on and on writing, and about 350 I had to cut out 50 pages and settled for that. So it was a combination of a research project, and I will be honest, a labor of love. I thoroughly enjoy doing this kind of work and thinking and what makes a speech good and how can engineers give what they have to the world even more. And that's probably how the book came about.
Well, thank you, Rashid. That's very interesting. And just a side note to the audience here is that we have recorded one of your lectures, and it will be available too. And I'll put that in the story notes at the end of this video. So that's a very interesting background. You've taken a lot of risks and a lot of advantages of your opportunities, and I think you've been very successful in what you've done. I do believe this is a very important book, and the topic is important, which I think would help any project manager or engineer, or anyone for that matter, become a better public speaker and storyteller. To me, the storytelling is kind of key. I have read a book, I don't recall the title right now, but it was entitled something along the line of he who tells the best story wins. And so I think when you tell a story, and we're not talking about telling a mistruth, but when you tell a story that makes sense to people, they tend to remember that. And so I think it's important to present a story. If you're doing a project or whatever you're engaged in, if you can tell it in a story format, I think it has a lot more power and sticking power. So with that, let's move into one area of focus I'd like to look at in this interview with you, and that is chapter 16, which is toward the end of the book. Starts on page 251. And you've entitled it Finding Flow Through Public Speaking and Storytelling. So what I'd like to get from you on this particular part is a little bit about the book. What's the book about generally, and then how does chapter 16 fit within the book as a whole?
Thanks, David. I couldn't agree with you more about storytelling. I believe the name of the book you may be referring to is Whoever Tells the Best Story Wins by Annette Simmons. It's a very well acclaimed book, and I have read it. It probably made me focus much more on storytelling too. I'll be honest, I looked down on it, and it was part of my education. It was a wake-up call. Storytelling is very powerful if you want your point to be remembered. The book is quite generic, though I've taken a slightly different approach. I have said, and I truly believe, that mastering public speaking and storytelling is not very difficult. What is more difficult is to make the commitment. I will do it. I will do it. This is going to help my career. So I have focused quite a bit on that. If you make the commitment, good things will follow. But to make the commitment, you have to say so much time and so much money. Otherwise, it's wishful thinking. So I suggested, with the best practices of project management, to actually write a project charter. In 2 years, I will have 5 speeches ready. They will be keynote quality. In 1 year, I will have a training program ready. But if you make those commitments with deliverables, time and money, you have a much better chance at becoming all you can be as a speaker and storyteller. So that's the format I've used in my book. That's the approach I've used. And I believe engineers and project managers can endorse this quite easily. I've also used a lot of research, and I didn't really research it. I read widely, David. And for example, there's a book called Emote, where the very effective speaker, he says all the audience really remembers is how they feel at the end of a speech. Therefore, the end of your speech is the most important. Start with that in mind. Now, I wouldn't ever have thought of that. And even if I'm speaking to a boss or to a team in representations, to plan it out, what do I want my colleagues to leave with? What do I want my co-workers to leave with? And I start knowing what I want to end with. It's a far more effective way of constructing a speech, and not only the knowledge but the emotion I want to leave them with, something I had never planned. So I've tried to bring factors like this into the book. I have a particular, I would say, almost a challenge with this fear of public speaking and the association with death. It's a bunch of nonsense. So I have devoted a fairly long chapter to debunking it as best I can and to fill it up with science. What actually triggers it off? What are the symptoms and what are the cures? I think this is probably what prevents most people from starting. Therefore, I dealt a little bit more with that. So I focused a lot on the good ending, on the fear of public speaking, and I also concentrated a lot on openings. I studied quite a few different openings. I think with these 3, you have a very good start. So I'm particularly proud of one chapter, and that's chapter 4. That's the chapter in which Kennedy gives his moon speech. And I encourage the reader to actually say the speech out loud using a technique I read from another book. And once you start getting those feelings that I can do it, I think you jump on board much more and you come to sense that this oratory, speaking, connecting with people can be very powerful. And this is no part of our education at all. So a mission of this book is to make engineers and project managers everywhere across the globe at least look into it. And if they find it useful, to go back to their colleges and say, folks, you'll need to start introducing this. It will help them in their careers. Finally, flow. Flow is something I've described it quite a bit in chapter 16. I ran into it from the books I'm reading, but athletes and musicians have become expert at harnessing it. And they said that flow can be, you should surround yourself by triggers to get you into the flow state. And I couldn't help noticing that public speaking was surrounded by these triggers. So that really caught my attention. And then the benefits of being able to be in that state was so obvious that it became a goal for me. Every time I speak, if I can go into the flow state, I will best serve my audience. So that is what drove me to write this chapter completely separately. And I believe it could be the lasting legacy of this book, because I predict 5 to 10 years from now, every speaker who seeks to perform truly well will have a working knowledge of flow, try to surround themselves by flow triggers, and especially there's a stage just before you go into flow where your body, the brain waves are of a certain type, and there's nitric acid which washes out the stress, which puts you in your ideal state of body. I come from a background of engines. I see it almost like you're tuning the engine to where you want it just perfect. So that's the basics on flow. But if I had to say what is flow in a few seconds, it's a state of mind and body combined where action and awareness merge. And most of what I'm saying, David, is from a book called The Rise of Superman, where it is studied in very great depth. But action and awareness, they start merging. And there's nothing magical about this. It's all about focus, bringing all your attention, all your focus into the now. Flow follows focus. A couple of observations is that we feel our best and we perform our best when we are in this exact state. They are able to map what's happening in our mind and what the neurochemicals that accompany flow are. So it's certainly an achievable state. And that is what I'm trying passionately to communicate. And I believe engineers will take on to this much more than the general population. That's a basic introduction to flow, David.
Okay, well, thank you for that explanation. I'd like to add a couple of thoughts to that. And, you know, of course, you and I both are PMPs. I've managed hundreds of complex IT projects. I'm sure you have your share under your belt. And we've been to a lot of, lessons and seminars, and we've read lots of books. And what you'll notice, or at least what I notice, is that so many of these books are focused in on techniques and kind of the nitty-gritty of the tactics of getting things done. And I think where your book is a very welcomed change in that typical mode of learning is that you've added kind of a soft skill, I might say, or some additional information that generally is ignored by most people, because we're kind of down in the weeds trying to figure out, well, what's the budget, how do you do this type of analysis, or we're looking at water flow or agile, etc. And so we get caught in the weeds, and in the meantime we forget how important it is to really interface with people, tell them the story of the project. Why is this project important, and what is the whole story of the project? And I think that's very powerful. A lot of this that you've written about reminds me of a guy by the name of Joseph Campbell, who studied and wrote a lot about mythology. And one of his better books and videos that he's done is The Power of Myth. And so there's certain archetypes that are stimulated, I believe, when you tell a story that all human beings share in common. And so by telling the story, it seems like you're really getting a deeper level commitment and understanding, and you're kind of stimulating the emotions of your audience and your team in terms of team building, for your project and this sort of thing. So I think this is a very, very important concept. And so I'd like to run over a little bit of the flow one more time and kind of ask you point blank. I have in my mind what flow is, and I think I've experienced it. I'm not very good about generating the triggers to cause me to go into that flow state, but describe maybe again what is flow from like a personal point of view. What does it feel like? What are some examples, this sort of thing? And then also, if you could look and give us some pointers on how somebody could master getting into the flow state.
Certainly. Yes. Flow is characterized by a lack of awareness of time and self. And the way I understand it as an engineer is that amongst other things, both myself, my ego, amongst other things, it's a mental construct, and so is time. So when some mental resources are assigned to what's the time, what am I doing, then we are aware of self and time. But in the flow state, because our attention is so completely on the task, that all our attentional resources are directed to the task. And therefore, we are able to concentrate and do it much better. And there's no question about it. Flow feels very good. It's not the feeling of good like when you have a wonderful cup of coffee. It's the feeling of mastery. I've really become better at this. I have connected deeply with my audience. And when I was speaking, I had no idea whether I spoke for 5 minutes or 50 minutes. There was no sense of time. I was not one bit involved with my ego. I was in deep connection with others. So these are my experiences of flow. Very often a mild flow state is induced when you're running and you've come to a certain stage of tiredness. People say that, and that's what keeps them running again and again. And I'll mention this point again. Today they say the difference between athletes who win gold medals and those who don't is their ability to get into flow. Because at a technical and physical skill level, they are all extremely close to each other. So if they are able to put all their resources into the race and not to worry about the outcome and what will happen, they have a better chance of winning. To become better at it, I'll suggest my favorite thing, read and read a lot. There are a few good TED Talks. Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, he's considered to be the godfather of flow. And his TED Talk is an excellent primer. It's about 18-20 minutes. His book called Flow, The Optimal State of Being, I think, is a book I read and I truly loved it. He says it doesn't matter what your rank is. He talked about people like plumbers and gardeners who could just transform landscapes because whenever they worked, they were in flow. People always reached out to them, even though they didn't have rank in the organization. But the book I would most recommend is the one I spoke about. It's called The Rise of Superman by Stephen Kotler. And what got my attention was that he was dying of a disease. And basically they had given up on him. And some friends took him surfing. And they insisted on taking him. And this is in his own words. I heard this on a Google Talk and read it in his book. That he entered the state, which we now know as the flow state, and somehow that reset his immune system, which was not functioning. And he slowly recovered from what seemed impossible. That caught my attention. This has got real value. So I read the book again and again, and that's what I would recommend. Read these books. But briefly, he says there are flow triggers in 4 categories. One is external, which is when you're in a position of risk, your focus automatically goes on the task in hand. There's something called deep embodiment. When you're listening more with your mind, with your entire body, when you're balancing, when you're taking in a rich environment, when complexity is requiring you to focus, that's a trigger. So you have a higher chance of going into flow. Similarly, he says there are some internal triggers. For example, the challenges to skills ratio. If you're doing something you're good at, you won't pay attention to it. And if it's so far out of reach, you won't pay attention to it again. So it's to find a sweet spot where the challenges are 4 or 5% harder than your present skills. That requires you to focus. You're not sure of whether you'll succeed or not. You're seeking feedback. And all these will keep your attention fully on the task. And you'll get this chemical release of the 4 or 5 neurotransmitters which put us into the flow state. And then there are social. When you're in a social group, if you're aware, for example, we never say no. The aim is to always uplift the group. And a lot of these extreme athletes have hacked flow in a social environment. There are 10 triggers in flow in the social environment. I think it's a marvelous opportunity for companies. And even the big companies like Microsoft and Patagonia, at least according to the book, are making flow a top priority, even a holy grail. Finally, creativity. When you are doing something that's creative, you lose all sense of self, all sense of time. And that is also a way of getting into flow.
Okay, Rashid, thank you for that very detailed explanation. And of course, the viewer can get your book and get more detail and some more practical applications from that. Is there, before we close the interview here, is there anything else that you would like to tell the audience that we haven't covered?
Sure. This is not really a plug, but as much as a mission. I have been deep in the world of engineering, and I know how much passion and joy it gives us, but it seems like our worlds are separated. So if any of your listeners are engineers or project managers, I would like to evangelize public speaking and storytelling through you to everyone around you, but especially to engineers. They have marvelous stories to share. And I hear this so often. Once I really get to know them, wow, they're really nice guys, they're really nice girls. And they have such an exciting world that they live in. So I would love my viewers to build bridges between two worlds that I live in, and I'm so grateful I'm a part of them.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Now, how does somebody get a hold of you or get your book? Do you have a website, and how can they purchase your book?
Yes, I do have a website. It's called www.necessarybridges.com. I have another website called rashidkapadia.com. I have an email address as well, rashid.kapadia@gmail.com. However, it should be on the video you put up. And of course, the book is available as an ebook on Amazon.
Right, and I'll include all this in the show notes at the end of the video, along with the references to the TED Talks, that sort of thing. So, Rashid, I really appreciate your time today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. I truly appreciate us running into each other by a chance encounter and finding that we have so many common interests. Much appreciated.
Thanks.